these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Cool topic today. We're going to talk Iraq. And guess what? Not COVID-19. Just for one podcast, we're gonna do some geopolitics and some history. And I promise to make this pretty interesting. To help me do that, I have with me, well, not technically with me, but on the phone, Stephen Nabil. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Congressman. It's an honor to talk to you and have this wonderful opportunity to discuss some Iraq politics. Like you said, not COVID-19 for once. So
Yeah. Absolutely.
We're going to stay away from the medical field for one episode.
Yeah. And in our office, we followed you on Twitter. You were one of the first people to tweet about the Soleimani strike. If that seems like years ago during that whole debate. Why it was a debate, I don't really know. We'll talk about that later in this episode. But were you on the ground in Baghdad when that happened?
No, I was not. Matter of fact, I was trying to go to Baghdad back in October, but I was advised not to due to my coverage of the protest that was ongoing. So security issues and the threats against journalists sort of prevented me from being there. But
in any case,
sources.
Yeah, in any case,
the airport
clearly had some sources.
Yeah.
And so you're Iraqi. You were a foreign exchange student. You came to the U.S. in 2004. You finished high school, went to ASU, Arizona State.
Sun Devils.
Yeah, and then when you went back to Iraq to cover the counter-ISIS campaign in 2014, you left in 2018. And this is interesting because you were reporting on Iranian-backed and sponsored popular mobilized forces. This is the Shia militias, and that led to harassment and threats against you. So we'll definitely talk about that.
Of
people
course.
would want to hear what that's like. We were just talking before we started recording, and I've got some very detailed questions about Iraqi politics in the future, but I don't really want to ask those. I want to bring this down to a more generalized level, and help people understand just how to think about the Middle East, how to think about Iraq, and the massive amounts of U.S. resources and political debate that has occurred over this small country. And so let's go back in time. Let's go back to the 80s, unless you think that we should go back to a different time. Honestly, that's really where should we start?
We can go back to the Syrian and Babylonian Empire, which is we're talking 5,000 years ago. So I don't think we have enough time, but no pun intended. But it's so deep, and you're right. I think we should start with possibly the 80s, where Iraq was coming out of what's known as the golden era in the 70s, thriving economically, oil prices were stable, good relations with the West, good relations with the East. It was a peaceful time where things were building up, and that was under the leadership of President Ahmed Hassan Bakr, who preceded Saddam Hussein, who took over in 1979. The Middle East started the earthquake in 1979 when Iranian Revolution happened and Saddam Hussein took over, and it was imminent that the two sides will collide, as they've been colliding pre-Christianity. The tensions between, it's interesting, one time I was reading that King Ashurbanipal from the Syrian Empire, which is pre-Christianity, was tired of the Elamites, who are in modern day Iran, were interfering in the internal politics of his country. So I'm like, wow, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
So these tensions go back further, and there's always the competition of the neighbors, and Iranians always politically thought of themselves as an empire, that they should have influence, and that's normal. Every sort of country with history or power So it's understandable that a country like Iran, or even Turkey, or even Iraq, had historical interest in spreading their influence over the area, over neighboring countries, and that's been documented throughout history. But the 80s, to me, are the debate still rages in Iraq that who started the war. Obviously, the people sympathetic to Iran are claiming now that, oh, it was Saddam's fault. I look at it historically that, it could have been, but Iran definitely wanted to export its revolution in 1979 to other countries, including Iraq. And that's very obvious from their speeches, from the speeches of Khomeini, who was the leader of the revolution. And also that I don't think Iraq was so eager to start the war. I feel like that they really knew that this is going to come to a huge challenge for them and the Gulf countries. And I'm sure the West had a hand in, comforting them that they will get support. And that started the war, which kept going on for years. Now, I went back to all the unclassified documents the CIA published. You can tell that there are so many efforts by the Iraqi government and their allies to convince Iran to cease fire, stop the war, but that failed. And I think Iranians did not get the memo that this war should end until the end of it. They were really eager to take over cities in Iraq at the end. They tried to occupy Basra, which is the heart of Iraqi economy, the oil fields and such in the south. Mm-hmm. And there was American support to Iraq to end the war, regain their territory, and then they reached the ceasefire. That sort of left a mark because Iran used what's known as Badr 9. Badr 9 were defections from the Iraqi army who went to Iran, who pledged allegiance to Iran. Some of them were prisoners of war who were brainwashed in camps, internal camps, and made allegiance to Khomeini versus Iraq. They fought on the Iranian side. They carried operations cross borders, assassinations, and such for years, including the 90s. And they were sort of the tipping point for many Iranian intelligence operations, being Iraqi, they had family inside of Iraq. So that carried us into, we're going to go back to the 90s era, but that carried into 2003. And later on, please let's touch back on Badr because they had a huge role in what's happening today.
As far as was this the basis for the Shia militias? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so Badr sort of grew from just a unit, a few trained units fighting alongside the Iranians. And then in the 90s, they had a jihadi fatwa, which I came across a few pages from the book of one of their religious scholars who's in Iran, Al-Ha'avi. He actually gave them the fatwa to kill a soldier if he's back on time off from military, to kidnap whoever they want, steal cars, trucks, properties belonging to the state, because he considered it jihad against Saddam. Some of the things he authorized them to do were just horrific, which I've heard after I published it on Facebook and Twitter that the book was, sort of pulled out. The author requested that not to be republished again because it's very embarrassing and criminal. In 2003, there were errors, and we're going to talk about this in details later, but one of them was allowing these elements to come back into Iraq without any sort of filtration. Some of them were considered heroes because they fought against Saddam. In fact, they were nothing but torturers of Iraqi prisoners of war. They were intelligence assets, and they fought on the Iranian side. So not truly your definition of rebels or counter-regime. They were just simply working for a different state. Now, that means they had their connections. They had their Iranian intelligence officers who were overseeing them. And when they were placed into positions in Iraq, that some of them did not really have Iraq's interest at heart. So right there, that's a recipe for disaster. How are they going to work on the American operation of Iraqi freedom, called the American invasion? How are they going to work with the American and the coalition side and their Iraqi counterparts when they were literally fighting against the same people a few months before that?
Yeah, and we learned this lesson in years to come, of course, as we found that the infiltration, and it's just still the case today, the infiltration of Iranian influence is severe. So let's keep it big picture and go back in time here. There's two main sects of Islam, Sunni and Shia. Do you think what is the main division between Iraq and Iran? Is it Sunni Shia or is it Persian Arab? What's more important?
I believe it's the Persian Arab because Iraq is majority Shia. So if it was a division of sect, it would have
That's
One of
true,
the
yeah.
interesting part in the CIA analysis report in the 80s is that Iran tried to emotionally attract the Iraqis to fight against Saddam on their side, but they failed. The Iraqi Shia refused to do so due to the Arab-Persian cross-historical dominations and such. So I feel it's the Arab-Persian more
So
of
maybe another question I would ask is, okay, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because Saudi Arabia is clearly a Sunni nation, and what do you think the answer would be to that question?
the Iraqi-Saudi relations went through turbulence. In the 80s, it was pretty well.
No,
In the
I meant
90s,
sorry,
yeah.
Iran and Saudi. So I'm just trying to figure out how people should. I'm trying to dumb this down as much as possible. Like how people should understand the divisions in the Middle East. Is it really Sunni Shia, or is it more Persian Arab? Is it just a mix of both, and which one takes priority?
I would say it's a mixture of two things. 50% of it is control of power, wealth, who's the bigger country in the region. That's 50% of it. The other 50% interchanges from a country to country. For instance, from Saudi Arabia to Iran, and I'm telling you how the street level of people, we're not talking academics or books or such, it's more of a sectarian division between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I see that in their comments, social media interactions, and also there's some sort of a Arab-Persian historical, obviously goes back to hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to Iraq is more of a mixed society. Yeah, there's Shia, Sunnis, there's Christians, Yazidis, Jews, obviously to a point. So people were not as sectarian or as fanatic or radical as other countries because they're used to having someone else. However, with Iraq, it's a historical thing that goes back to thousands of years, that they had a dispute with Iran over every time there was something, no matter who the government was. With Turkey and Iran, obviously, it's more of a pride who's going to control the Middle East, the Ottomans or the Persians. So it's always something. Every country is different, but goes back to who's going to control.
So speaking of control, after Saddam got done with the Iran-Iraq war, which was devastating for both countries, Saddam thought, well, I should probably start a new war, and invaded Kuwait. So what was the underlying reasoning for that? And I'm also curious, how old were you back? Were you alive back then? Not sure how old you were.
I was a kid when that happened. I do remember some flashbacks, but a lot of it is obviously what my parents told me. When that happened, and I'm going to get to what I was doing at that point as a kid with my family. But Saddam was suffering because he realized how bad the war was for 8 years. Iraq's economy was crippled. Now you have all these orphans and widows and a lot of money to cover all these, the oil revenues start going down.
Mm-hmm.
He blamed Kuwait for playing with oil prices. Obviously, we're seeing the whole Saudi-Russia war right now with oil. So just to give an idea to our audience or listeners, what does that mean? When a country decides to cut back or not cut back production, prices fluctuate. Kuwait is a major oil producer, so obviously they could have a role in that. And Saddam he kept asking the Gulf countries, look, I defended you from Iran. Iran will take over the area. It's your time to pay me back. Don't lower the oil prices. So I feel like the oil prices were a huge breaking point for Saddam, and there are many other reasons. He obviously was a dictator and wanted to take over land. But I feel like if the U.S. ambassador at that point would have made it clear to him, look, if you invade, we're going to bring the whole force on you, I think he might have reconsidered.
Yeah.
But if you go back to what she told him, that we won't interfere in a dispute between Arab countries, to me that sounds like America says, go ahead. And that's a dangerous idea to have for a dictator. So that I wish we didn't have that. Anyways, that's 30 years ago. Yeah, but anyway, so Saddam lost power, and this is very important. Saddam lost power in almost 15 states out of 18. One of them was my city. I remember we had Kurdish rebel forces taking over the north, and the Shia rebels, aided by Iran, took over the south. Now, Saddam tried to make a comeback, and we had a debate in D.C. based on all the books I read, that there was an internal debate in Bush-Senior's leadership team called Powell, forgot the other guy's name. Anyway, so they were debating, should we interfere and help the rebels and topple Saddam, or should we just stand down? And there was an internal debate of, if we do, is Iraq going to just be taken over by Iran? So we knew sort of what could happen later in the early administration, and they stood down. Saddam was able to take over 15 states back. I remember the Iraqi helicopters shooting down rebels, and the entire city was running away because we were afraid of a chemical attack.
Yeah.
It was just a massive, massive problem. And then started the sanctions, which you know how that ended.
Well, how did the Iraqi people feel in the early 90s? I mean, were they wishing that U.S. forces had actually toppled Saddam? It would have been easy for U.S. forces to do that. The political considerations, as you mentioned, were they came out on one side of it. What was your typical Iraqi thinking at that point, or does it just depend on whether they were Sunni or Shia or what tribe they were from? I mean, obviously you can't generalize everybody.
Sure. Well, after Kuwait, the morale was really low. People felt that why did we even go in? You shattered our army. Everything was completely opposite to where it could have been. The sanctions crippled the economy completely. And now we're talking a country that was enjoying a wealth 15, 20 years ago. Now all of a sudden they can't buy milk. There's no soda in the market. There's no medicine. There's nothing. So people were obviously, when that happens, what do? You blame your president, like it's happening now in America, that when something goes wrong, we can't go to the beach. Let's blame the governor. Let's blame the president. And that's how it goes on. Anyway, so people were completely blaming Saddam. Had nothing to do with Sunni or Shia. There were a few people who were loyal to Saddam. There were strong Ba'ath Party members who were not just in it because they have to get a job. No, they were in it because they were loyal. I remember all my dad's friends, everybody that could trust each other would definitely talk and criticize Saddam, but highlight the trust each other, because Saddam encouraged the spy state. Your brother could actually write a report to the local Ba'ath Party and say, "Look, my brother is spreading jokes about Saddam,"
or not wearing a mask in public.
Yeah, there you go. Call the cops.
It'd be funny if that weren't true, but unfortunately it's true in America right now.
There.
Yeah.
Yeah, but anyways, that was happening, that people would actually fear. We used to have a saying that we fear the walls because they can hear us. That's how dangerous it was, that your neighbors could tell on you because you cracked a joke about Saddam. I remember my dad and his friend, we speak Aramaic. That's my native tongue. I'm Nasirian, I'm not Arab, but I do speak Arabic as my second language. But we spoke Aramaic, so that even made it a little bit more encrypted for my dad to crack a joke. Not a lot of people understand Aramaic, but he would still use terms for Saddam, terms for the UN, terms for America when he discussed politics with his friend when they were driving, and it just mean the car with them. That's how psychologically people were scared. And this is very important, because in 2003, Bremer came in and he said, "Okay, we're going to have elections. This was a huge error. We were caged. We were prisoners, and then all of a sudden, you're free, so choose who you want." Who do you think people are going to vote for? They're going to run to vote for a strong man that could protect them, and that strong man all of a sudden is not just Saddam. It's multiples of Saddam across the sects, across the different people who make up Iraq. And that was dangerous, because people did not know what democracy really means. And I don't blame them. We didn't have that for decades. Saddam killed anyone that would have thought of starting a political party or even writing an article against him. So everybody else was outside the country. So here's the thing. I wish two things could have done, or three things. First, that, Kuwait War, prior to him invading, if we warned him really strongly, that would have never happened. Second, the sanctions, they did not really hurt Saddam. He still enjoyed his palaces. They hurt the people, and that was bad. I wish we did that differently, and a lot of the U.S. military leaders agreed with that Bill Clinton did not really read the picture. He was starving Iraqis, hoping that they're going to do something, versus him obviously taking on Saddam and stopping his illegal oil selling. By the way, in the 90s, Iran helped Saddam evade sanctions. They were trading oil illegally with him. They were trading food illegally with him, and everything else. So they had a hand in that, in undermining what's happening in the area. So who was left, to hung out to dry with the Iraqis?
Right.
In 2003, I wish, here's the complete vision. We invaded, clear, quick win. America won, but here's the thing. Post April 9th, It was a series of mistakes and errors, completely done by the local commanders, Bremer, his aides, and others. If Iraq was placed under sort of a martial law, look, nothing changes, stay in your homes, no one's going to kill you, just let's just sort out the country, and then keep the military intact, not just disbanding the army.
Yeah, that's well documented now in hindsight that was our biggest mistake. That it was such an enormous mistake. It was so obvious in hindsight that the Iraqi people were like, okay, fine, you're in charge now, so be in charge. But then we just disbanded the army, and it was just chaos.
We're like, we're not going to patrol the street. I remember that. They said, we would go to them, say, please, they're like, we can. We're not trained to do that. We don't know the area. And they disbanded the army. And Bremer was under pressure from the Shia and Kurdish politicians to do that.
Yeah.
Disbanding the army, let them grow their militias, and let them have the failed state the Iraqi security forces are facing right now is Iraq doesn't really know who's controlling the street, which obviously is the militias.
Well, it's prime recruiting too. I mean, you get a bunch of young men who had a job and now don't have a job, and there's a clear person to blame for you not having that job. So why not start a militia? I mean, what would you do if it had happened to you? So, But the mentality of the Iraqi people is really interesting to me, because I've had this conversation a million times with lots and lots. I've deployed twice to Iraq.
I'm sure you did.
And it's never binary. Americans fall into this trap of binary thinking, especially when it comes to foreign. Well, not all foreign policy, but this particular situation. It was either a terrible idea or it was justified. More and more Americans fall on this terrible idea notion, and that Iraqis hated it, that we were, oppressors moving into there. That's Americans think in very binary terms that way. That's almost never how the conversation plays out with an Iraqi. And it's so interesting. And again, just even being on the ground, it's never an emotional conversation. It's always actually very pragmatic. Every time I talk to an Iraqi, it's a very pragmatic, nuanced conversation. It always sounds exactly like what you're describing, which is, listen, we definitely didn't like Saddam. We weren't really mad at you guys for getting rid of him. We just think you screwed up a lot of things, and then this is what should have been done better. And that's a very reasonable, frankly, way to look at it. I do want to back up a little bit, though, which was like why we invaded in the first place, because that's another huge topic of debate. And I'm not sure we'll settle it today. And because it's obvious in hindsight that there were no weapons of mass destruction that warranted an invasion. Okay, so we know that. The question is, and this is again where Americans need a little bit more nuance in their lives. The question is, what was reasonable to believe at the time, given the facts that we had at the time? 9/11 had just occurred. What was Saddam doing at this time? Because as I understand it, he certainly wasn't denying about anything about chemical or weapons of mass destruction, primarily because he didn't want the Iranians to think that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction.
Correct.
And so, there's just more to it, isn't there?
Well, here, obviously, and this goes back to what you just mentioned, it completely obvious. I agree with you that Iraq is not a yes or no question. Iraq is not just a what do you think? Because, and the answer could change. Obviously, if you're asking Iraqi today, after watching the militias and the government forces murder 700 protesters, he's definitely going to tell you, oh, I wish this never happened. Mm-hmm. And that answer could change tomorrow. So obviously the answer changes. When the Abu Ghraib prisons came up, pictures, the torture pictures came out, every Iraqi was angry. Yeah. So that's why the answer changes. Now, Saddam played the tough guy role. He had to. He was in a country where revolutions, takeovers were a very common thing. His party came through a bloody revolution in 1963, so he knows exactly what could happen when people sense weakness. Now, you're enemies with Iran, you're enemies with the West, and you have some powerful foes. So I'm sure the whole you nailed it. The tough guy act was part of it. Could have we done things differently? Possibly. I am not the person that was reading the intelligence reports to know exactly what was happening, but I think Saddam could have been taken out a different way. But here's the thing: how are you going to take out someone that refuses to leave? And so, if it was a must to take, I'm looking at this not as an Iraq.
And he's got all these body doubles too. I mean, this is kind of an interesting little segue to get on. It's just like, how Saddam's security mechanisms were unbelievable. Is it true he had just lots and lots of body doubles that would kind of be all over Iraq? You never really knew where he was, or is that kind of a myth?
Well, I think it was a myth because we never found anyone that actually was a body double.
Yeah.
And again, this is Saddam, very mysterious person. He could have had definitely body doubles. Did he use other people as decoys? I'm sure.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Yeah, I mean, just kind of decoys. Yeah.
He had palaces all over the place. Actual palaces.
Oh, they're amazing. I've been to them. I stayed in the one in Basra. And
you loved it, huh? That's amazing.
Well, it wasn't very nice when I got there, but it didn't. I mean, it was a shell, right? I was there in 2008, so it had long been looted. But you could tell that in its heyday, it's just this most opulent, beautiful place. And there's another palace just right next to it, and then there's another one right next to that one. I guess for different wives. Like I don't know what the reasoning was.
I think it was Basra. I saw the water. We took a river boat.
Yep.
I think he actually built them or he built a different mini one for each president, an Arab president that was there one time for some sort of a conference. So he had things like that. He would actually build an entire complex for that. Anyway, so back to that question, his security mechanism was very completely, you can't penetrate it. He used his tribe, he used his loyalists as first line of guard. There's a second line, and there's a third line, and there's the Revolutionary Guard. So it was really hard for him to leave. You can't really support. In 1995, Sunni officers tried to rebel against him, and he quashed that really quick and just hung everybody. So it's not easy to take out Saddam. I will give whoever thought that war was the only option, that ammunition to debate is that you can't really take out Saddam by talking to him. Now, I've heard recently that there were some efforts by an Arab country to sort of mediate and have Saddam leave peacefully and hand over for elections and such. But I heard that Kuwait, and again, I don't have any proof of this, was refusing such idea and pushed for the war to take over and shoot down the Arab mediation effort. So, I mean, that's when you understand that the neighboring countries did not want Saddam to stay in power, had something to gain from him gone. And now some of that changed. I'm sure the Saudis would take that back and say, no, we would rather have Saddam than Iranian on our borders.
Right.
So,
what about Syria? What was Assad's relationship with Saddam?
Assad and Saddam hated each other. I'm talking about the father. They really hated each other, and they were at each other's throats. I remember watching news when I was a kid and characters and comics. It was all anti-Assad, and I mean, he would literally curse him on TV. Saddam hated him. So Syria and Iraq never, and Assad backed Iran against Iraq in the war. So obviously, the vendetta Saddam had against him. Saddam actually helped the forces fighting Assad in Lebanon, including the Christians, in the civil war of Lebanon. That's how intensive the Middle East politics are. That Saddam was training Lebanese Christian militias to fight Assad in Lebanon just to get back at him for his help to the Iranians and the Shia and the Kurdish factions against Saddam. So just so intertwined. It's not, you know what I mean?
It is. Yeah. But like the Ba'ath Party has some connection to Syria too, because I mean, when we're tracking bad guys in like the late 2000s, my deployment there in 2010, they were difficult to find, but we always knew where they were. They were in Syria. So, when we left in 2011, everybody knew they were just going to come right back. And lo and behold, they did. They just called themselves ISIS. A lot of people say that ISIS was basically the Ba'ath Party. Like it's not as ideological and not as religiously driven as they were made out to be. That in fact, like the real smart people at the top of this thing were Ba'ath Party, insurgents. Do you agree with that?
Everybody knew that, including yourself, myself, but apparently President Obama back then did not. So that's where the problem started. I literally, and I'm going to tell you, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not, I'm not taking a Republican or Democrat line here. I'm just taking the issue of Iraq. When Obama won, I literally cried that night. I weep, not because Obama won, McCain lost. No, it was because I knew what's going to happen to Iraq. I witnessed all these efforts by Americans and Iraqis, and all the sacrifices were given. I knew all that's going to go down the drain the minute he won, because every Iraqi knew, like you said, taking out the forces the way Obama promised would have definitely warranted a takeover of Al Qaeda, and that happened just a few years after. Back in 2003, when you disband in the military, you've got well-trained security forces, intelligence officers, weapons specialists, you name it. They just came out of 3 wars or 4 wars. They're very well trained. They know the terrain. They know everything. And they know the border. And then you just tell them, go home. No money to feed your kids, nothing. There were easy recruitment, obviously what you said earlier. There were easy recruitment to the first factions. Factions were not truly Islamic. They were more of anti-America insurgents. And then it started translating when Al Qaeda took over and started making it more of a religious war, which gained all these foreign fighters and jihadists from all over the world. Syria was helping because Assad was afraid that Americans on his border means they could invade any day. So to me, stabilizing Iraq post 2003 was a huge mission for Iran, for Syria, for possibly, I wouldn't say Turkey, but I would say definitely Iran and Syria. They really did not want to see Iraq stable. If American democracy succeeds there, guess what? There are people going to start being sympathetic to America, and an invasion could happen. And that's what they're thinking. They gave aid to terrorists. Nouri Maliki, which interestingly, the former prime minister, sure you know him, he accused Syrian government of harboring terrorist camps and sending intelligence officers to guide operations or suicide operations inside of Iraq. Now, Nouri Maliki later on actually supported Assad against his people, so that tells you how politics are.
Yeah,
and,
but was he right though? I mean, was Assad doing that? Was he correct? Was Maliki correct?
Well, we were seeing confessions of terrorists on TV talking about how they got trained in Syria.
Yeah, and that's where we tracked them. Like I said, in Syria, for everybody's geography right now. I mean, Syria is on the western border of Iraq. Iran is on the eastern border of Iraq. Iraq is sandwiched between Syria and Iran. And I also want to caveat, when I said the Ba'ath Party, that's Saddam Hussein's political party. Right, and so
it was a one-party rule. That's it.
Right.
So, and the ISIS, when I was there, and obviously I've have thousands of documents I've looked at. A lot of them, they were not your bin Laden terrorists. They're not. ISIS was a state. They had their bureaucracy. They had their courts. They had their expense reports where someone had to a second signature of that, which is very interesting. And that tells you, like you said, they were not your cave terrorists. They're actually former state members, former security officers who just one of them. I had a friend who was interested in interviewing a prisoner, a journalist, and she told me that during the interview, he was an ISIS commander that was captured. He barely mentioned anything Islamic. It was all about, we want to take back what's ours. We want to take back the power. So it was all about the power. The guy wanted his badge and his gun again, and he felt that he was robbed. So he, chose whoever came through, and unfortunately that was a terrorist organization. So, a series of mistakes from 2003, and then the icing on the cake was the withdrawal in 2011, where we left the Iraqi troops half untrained. We gave the power to Maliki, knowing he's a sectarian leader. He would give a huge recruitment tool to the ISIS and Al Qaeda by inflaming sectarianism in Sunni provinces, arresting them, accusing them of certain things. So that sort of made the ground in the perfect storm for 2014, which shook the whole world, not just the Middle East. That obviously everybody was on fire. So
right, all right. So obviously, mistakes were made. Hindsight is 2020. We ended up with ISIS in the mid 2000s. Where do you think ISIS is now? I mean, where are we really at on that fight? Or is there a chance of resurgence, or were they so badly decimated that we shouldn't worry about it anymore? What's going on in Syria? I mean, Syria is just not even in the news anymore.
I mean, ISIS is decimated militarily. They're decimated as far as ranks. However, they had a resurgence lately, and ISIS will always be there unless you really put a full-on solution. For instance, we all know what happened in Syria, and it's happening now that we wanted the European countries to take back their citizens, try them, and they were refusing to do so. So you leaving all these, well-trained commanders and terrorists in camps guarded by local militias, local forces, whoever they are in Iraq or Syria. I mean, that could warrant a breakout, like what happened in Abu Ghraib. That could warrant a regional. You never know who's going to come and try to utilize ISIS for their own gains. You're talking about a very volatile region that things change within the hour, and somebody could use someone against his neighboring country. So ISIS could be used by anybody. I mean, economically, politically, you never know. Are they going to be there as a boogeyman? I'm sure they are. They're actually carrying attacks, small-time attacks in Iraq right now, which is worrying the authorities. Now, Iraq definitely mishandled, or the government of Iraq mishandled ISIS post-2017. Some people were let go where they're not supposed to. Some people were just paid off their way out. So a lot of mistakes were made on the Iraqi government's side. I didn't really see any rehab programs for families, children of ISIS members, none of that. And I'm very worried that all these mistakes committed by the locals, the Iraqi government. Some militias I heard reports of abuses at refugee camps for ISIS families, and all these could warrant a resurgence and obviously a 2.0, which what I'm worried about, if that happens, they have learned a lot from their mistakes in 2014 and what went wrong for them. So are they going to be better equipped now? Now the ideology is always going to be there. All it takes is someone to come in and, sweet talk his way out of, or talk his way into the minds of a young radical person who thinks that Islam truly means you got to go fight. So all it takes for someone to use social media to talk to someone in America and Canada and Europe, and we saw how that works. So it's definitely a threat that's not going to just disappear because it's fueled by anger, by politics, and mainly by religion. And that, all you got to do is misinterpret a few verses, and now you've got a war.
What you said about the mishandling of ISIS prisoners and just letting them go for no apparent reason, that struck an interest with me because it reminded me of the very strange sense of Iraqi justice. I never could quite comprehend it because it wasn't consistent. It seemed like it always went between two extremes. Either they were committing war crimes against people, and like killing somebody, or just letting them go and being like, he's a good guy. I'm like, why is he a good guy? We have evidence that says he's not a good guy. No, he's fine. And you're like, what? Because I worked with Iraqi police for so long that you would see this weird dichotomy, and it's not based on kind of, I think, justice and systems of evidence as in due process as we would understand it. We tried to implement those notions there, and I don't know if they've taken hold any better now than they did back then.
No, it's much worse now. It's controlled by militias, it's controlled by political parties, and it's who you know, and the people in power, if they find use for you for their own programs and agendas, then you're a good guy, like you said, quote unquote. This interesting, last night I was talking to a friend of mine, he's a Sunni from Anbar, and he was venting to me. He said, look, I came back, they fled the city when ISIS took over. He said, they all know each other. It's a very small town in Anbar. I'm not going to name the town, obviously, it's a very small town, but I'm sure you know it. So I'm going to tell you off the record later. Okay. Anyways, he said that so-and-so, who's a known person in the city, him and his kids or his sons joined ISIS immediately, and they ran things for them, administration work and all that. He said he made a deal with one of the Iranian-backed politicians, and now all of a sudden they're friends. He said his son, who was part of ISIS, now carries a badge of Iraqi security one of the security administrations, and carries a badge and a gun, and he's in task of pointing out who's the bad guy. And he's like, this person doesn't like me. We go back to the pre-ISIS days of him being a radical. We would always debate and things. So now I'm scared he could actually come out and take revenge on me. So you look at how things play out. This guy was an ISIS member, and now he's all of a sudden the good guy, quote unquote.
Right.
So
it's
so extreme, that, yeah.
Well, it's just that Americans can't even comprehend that kind of world. It's almost like post-apocalyptic, full of like roving bands of bandits that are, that with tribal affiliations, and it really is that sense of loyalty. I find myself thinking, I wonder when ISIS rolled through Anbar, because I was always stationed in Anbar in both deployments.
Yeah.
And the people we worked with, I wonder if they're alive. I have no way of knowing. And it's scary to think, because there's a good chance they aren't. I mean, I don't know. Or did they just join ISIS? Because what choice did they have? It's an open question. And it also begs another question, which is there ever any hope of nationhood in places like, specifically places like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, okay, where there's obvious divisions in Sunni, Shia, and Christian. Well, in Iraq's case, the Kurdish, and Syria's case, the Kurdish population. Will there ever be a nation? Do they ever think of themselves that way? Or are they better off splitting or maybe forming like a confederation of different states? I mean, what does the future look like?
Well, to answer that, and a lot of the judicial problems, the security forces problems, goes back to 2003, when Bremer put the 25 people in charge based on their sex and race. He established that. So we still have that, where they're trying to form the government, and it's all about what the Sunni is going to get, what the Shia is going to get, the Kurds. So unless Iraq, as a state, not talking to people, because the people, if I'm sure you're familiar with the protests, I know you're off staff, we're following up and all that. The protests were very clear. The people came out to the streets and said, we're done with this. We don't want your government system. We want to rule ourselves. We don't want some former oppositions just, stealing our resources forever because, they were against Saddam. We're done with that.
Right. So the protesting against who exactly?
Against the entire regime that's ruling Iraq. Everything. The idea of 2003 placing these people in power, they're just tired of that. They're saying, look, we want to rule our country. We don't want to be puppets to Iran or America. And that's very good, because that younger generation, all these kids were between the age of 16 to 35. That was the oldest I watched, or I saw. So when we really wanted to have a patriotic feeling of, we want to have relations with these countries. We don't want to be subjected by Iran. And that's amazing that finally they want to build their country and they want to rise up.
And were these mixed protesters, or was it only Sunni protesters? Or
no, it was mixed? A complete mixed. I covered it, and from the ground, there were Christians, Sunnis, Shiites. I mean, a lot of it was obviously happening in majority Shia cities, because the Sunni cities were threatened by the militias. If you dare to do this, you're ISIS. We're going to paint you as ISIS, or we're going to, one of the activists in Mosul told me, we know very well if we try something here, they could just abandon their post and let ISIS come over. So
right. Because ISIS is Sunni, just so everyone understands. So it's easy to paint them that way.
Yeah, they could use them politically like that to quash the protest. So anyway,
and also just for context, we're talking about late 2019. Is that
this
correct?
Happened in October 1st. It started as unemployment. Students were protesting. I mean, there were PhD and master's degree holders who went out and said, look, we just want a fair employment. We just want a fair chance at jobs. And they were met with hot water trucks and riot control. I mean, so Iraqis watched girls standing and being shot down by hot water. And that really pissed off a lot of people. So people, a series of things happened for almost a week. One of the commanders of the ICTS forces, I'm sure you remember them, they dress in black, they're American trained, very well effective against ISIS. Their commander, who was hailed as a war hero against ISIS, was just completely taken out of context and replaced with no apparent reason, which pissed off people. Because Iraqis finally found an inner uniting, war general that, Sunnis liked him, Shiites liked him, and all of a sudden you're gone. So that fueled the anger that, look, every time we're trying to establish some sort of a stabilization, the government takes whoever the icon is out.
Yeah.
So on October 1st, people come out, they're met with lethal force, which, made, I'll say, at least 1 million of, younger unemployed generation come out and say enough is enough. And it was a bubble that burst, and till now, I'm sure post-corona, people are going to go out again because they're tired. They know their economy could collapse any moment. Iraq depends, and this is important, Iraq depends on oil for 90% of their budget. So when oil prices go down like they are right now, guess what? They're worried about, making income or not, paying their salaries. So that's, but, we supported the protest. America did, and that was the right thing to do. And that sort of put more pressure on the government. But I don't think this, to answer your question now after all this context, I don't think this Iraqi system of regime is going to last. And Iraq is not better off dividing, because you're just going to create three enemies, depending on who's running them, not the people, the politicians. They're going to, keep fighting over resources. So you just, tripled your problem. But I think if there's a strong, powerful government that, rule of law, no one's above the law, that could work in Iraq without any sort of divisions and letting all these warlords and militias rule.
So you still think Iraqis can still have some semblance of nationhood and feel like an Iraqi, that they still might consider themselves Sunni or Shia first and tribal affiliation first, but
not the younger generation. Not
the younger generation might feel Iraqi first.
They hate it. They hated the sectarianism. They hated all that, and they shouted it out. They were very clear. They said, our fathers and grandfathers were afraid. We're not. We don't want this.
Right.
We want to live together. And they were very clear, and they were very secular. So I that brought hope that there's the silent majority of people that finally are rising and saying we're going to take back our country. So that's the only hope for Iraq. If this younger generation that's born in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, if they rule the country, things would look differently versus the guy that old guard, sectarian, that definitely going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, because for Westerners, it's hard to, and non-Muslims, it's a little hard to understand the difference between Sunni and Shia. I mean, I know that there's a lineage difference between the lineage of Muhammad, but beyond that, to an outsider, it doesn't seem like the differences between these two sects should invite so much violent conflict.
Again, and here's the thing: that conflict was used by countries like Iran, by former regime officials in Saddam's regime. So that was fueled by politics as well. Yeah, I'm sure there are people who are radical. We find that everywhere, but that sectarian division and rift was very much fueled by the government.
Right. I see what you're saying.
Every politician wanted to gain the votes. So playing on the race card, playing on the fear mongering. If you don't vote for me, the Sunnis are coming. If you don't vote for me, the Shias are coming.
Right.
That definitely
it's more like identity politics than it is true religious belief.
Oh, and it's very dangerous. So when I watch that here playing out in America, I'm like, no, please, no, you don't want this, because I know what happened back then in Iraq.
Yeah.
And Iraqis are, Sunnis and Shias intertwined. They married each other. They lived next to each other. So all this was foreign to them when all these politicians coming from Iran and other countries just start fueling that speech. And that Al-Qaeda comes in, Zarqawi comes in and bombs Shia mosques. So just a lot of, something was imposed on them. And in the protest,
right.
They tried to clarify, we don't want this.
That's so true. I mean, identity politics is the oldest trick in the book, and it's the oldest way to control people and get groups to believe a certain thing and then to follow you. And it's also the most divisive and conflict-ridden ideology. And I talk about it all the time, how terrible it is for our country, and only the most devilish and opportunistic politicians will use it, and they use it constantly. Obviously, I'm referring. I think the left is what uses this the most. They'll accuse the right of using identity politics. I fail to see that argument. I think they're reading into some things that just are not based in identity politics, but that's just my opinion. Always happy to have that debate. In any case, whoever is using identity politics is,
It's definitely dangerous to the country.
It's
like
literally
I said,
dangerous.
when I hear that, I'm like, please don't do this. Because I remember in 2006, Iraq was on fire. I'm sure that's close to your deployment town and what area there exactly. Two of the icons of the Shia Sunni rift politically, they would, fight in the parliament. They would go on TV and just fight each other on crossfire shows. One of the not a politician, one of the state admins was close to everything. Told me years later, he said one morning they were fighting in the parliament, Sunnis are this, Shias are that. And then he said at night, I saw them at someone's house, the president's house. They had a huge meeting. Soleimani was the president. And he said they were literally sitting next to each other, eating and laughing. So that tells you that, the identity cards were used.
Yeah.
The politics.
All facade.
Get the votes. Everyone's winner. And that's it. Let people fight it out in the streets and let's go home. So that's what happened in Iraq.
Let me ask you another divisive issue in the United States, the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal. We won't have to get into the details of the debate surrounding that, but generally speaking, how does it affect Iraqis? What did Iraqis think about it? Was that divided basically along lines of people politically loyal to Iran and people not?
Here's the thing, Iraq currently has majority of Iraqis are not sympathetic to Iranian influence in Iraq. That's very obvious.
Mm-hmm.
A percentage of Iraqis, could be 10%, could be 15, could be 5, probably played down, I just don't have it exactly, are sympathetic to Iranian influence. Now, everybody that's not sympathetic almost agrees that Obama's administration handed Iraq to Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them go deeper into this started in 2003 and then Obama completed it. So obviously they were not really fond of having Iran play free, get all the money they wanted. So that sort of translates to today. They say because of that, the militias are running rampant. The militias started growing in Iraq post obviously the JCPOA. And also the Iranian influence started growing in the area, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. So Iran wants to project its power. You're not talking about a country that just wants to stay inside their borders peacefully. No. You're talking about a country that wants to have a hand in everywhere in the Middle East, believe that spear of destiny, that they have to do that. And then also they believe annihilating countries like Israel would bring about the apocalypse. So you've got a very dangerous regime that you're dealing with. You can't just let him go, run free and say, okay, do whatever you want. Obviously, we know they have a missile system. They just shot so many of them at our base. We know that they have so many intentions, and they're making it clear. All you got to do is watch TV. They're the leaders. They're not talking about staying home inside their borders. They're talking about spreading the message. So obviously that agreement to me was it put us away from war, but it was definitely done wrong. It wasn't done right.
Yeah. And
it's definitely not a good agreement, not to Iraq, not to America, not to any neighboring country.
And the spreading of that message, the message of the revolution and what that entails, which is, funding surrogate forces throughout the Middle East to include the PMFs in Iraq, 14
Hezbollah
FYC and Hezbollah. Houthis in Yemen. They're all over the place. And so that never stopped. In fact, it increased because they were better funded. And that brings us to 2020, which is maybe the most memorable year of not the most memorable year of the 2000s. I think that's reserved for 2001. 2008's a pretty memorable year too, but man, 2020 is at least probably second place to 2001. That's I'm gonna describe 2020 that way. It's been ridiculous, and it started.
We're still in April, so
there's an election. There's a presidential election at the end of the year. This year is insane.
When Iraqi memes and American memes are completely aligned, just change the language about 2020. I'm like, oh my god, this is definitely. Everyone agrees on this that this year has been crazy. And
do they watch Tiger King in Iraq? Is there an Iraqi subtitles on Tiger King or Arabic subtitles?
They haven't. No, they were busy watching the other shows. They're obviously fans of Game of Thrones. They're
Okay.
fans of Money Heist, but not Tiger King yet, thankfully. So we're hoping to keep it down.
Well, will it be too? Because I know there's a particular story where a group of special operations guys were getting into a palace of Saddam, one of Saddam's palaces, and they'd open up the door, and no joke, a tiger was in there. Like they ran into a tiger in one of Saddam's palaces, just like the movie The Hangover, like the exact same thing played out. Not joking. This happened.
No.
Saddam had a lot of wild animals like that in his palaces.
And it was mainly his son O'Day. He was definitely a Tiger King. He was, the weird guy who collected.
Oh my God, that's the next season. How about the problem
Netflix
is like
should definitely jump on him.
Yeah, there's got to be footage. I guess it's hard to. It'd be hard to make because you can't interview him. He's dead, isn't he? They're both dead, right?
Oh yeah,
both sons are
a very bad guy. Yeah.
They were
he
insane.
Raped women,
they were. I mean, there's some movies made about that. I would suggest. I mean, their lifestyle was just awful. It was just a path of destruction against the Iraqi people. What they go to like nightclubs and just party it up, and then just, like you said, they're just assaulting women constantly, killing people, torturing people. Just doing whatever the hell they wanted.
He was a psycho, and he would always fly in Russian girls to party with them. Like I'm talking groups of 40, 50, and this is during the sanctions. So he was just weird. Yeah, and he had a very expensive collection of cars. I've seen pictures of them, and some of them are in the Iraqi galleries right now. But so
this year, 2020, like the Soleimani strike happens. So.
I never thought that would happen. I never thought in my wildest dreams that would happen. Well, Soleimani was revered as immortal, that he's there. And he was truly running the show in most of the time in Iraq. He was picking at times who's going to be the prime minister. He was mediating in disputes. He had a stronghold of Iraq. Starting from the Kurdish areas down to the further south. At the same time, he was running things in certain areas in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. So he was the godfather of exterior Iranian politics. Now, here's the thing. Iranian politics externally are divided into two. There's your guys in suits, the Zarif people who, we love the world, let's live in peace, that, talk about that. And then there's the actual operations of the IRGC, which are completely different, that are, using a different tone, different language, and they want to project influence on other countries. So that's why when I watch Zarif tweet, and I'm like, seriously, who believes this guy?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, he gets media time, he gets all that, and he just, it fools people into believing, oh, no, look at him. They want peace. No, what they're doing on the ground is different. So Soleimani was essentially the icon of that. He was revered as the hero by Iranians, and he was revered as the guy that he's our godfather by Iraqi militias and others. So taking him out left, all these people without the godfather that was holding all the families together. I mean, I'm using a Godfather movie reference, but it's truly like that, because all these militias, you're talking about tens of militias in Iraq alone who were held by Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who's his man in command in Iraq. We all knew this for years. Now, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, his death was not talked about a lot, but it definitely disrupted a whole lot of Iran influence in Iraq, because Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis defected and fought with the Iranians against Iraq in the 80s. He was very loyal to the RGC. He grew up in the ranks, and he's a fanatic in the cause. He was truly not in it for the money or anything. He really believed in the Wilayat al-Faqih, which means, the ruler, the Shia ruler, which, Khomeini and then Khamenei, he believed in that. So he held together all these warlords who were in it for money, for killing, for whatever. Right. Now he's gone.
And so the critics would say, because they're Western critics and they also disagree with everything Trump does, and that's really the only reason, maybe not the only reason, but the most likely reason they're critiquing. But so they would say that listen, just because you cut off this one head of the snake doesn't mean another one grows right back in its place. It's like, just because we lose our general doesn't mean another general can't quickly take his place. Now, that is true in the American sense, in the way the American military works. We operate in a way where we are all replaceable, and easily so. Now, what I don't think people understand is how the Middle East works. It is not that way. Right, like this guy's cell phone has his contacts on it. Like you can't. Like he's the only one who talks to these people.
He's Soleimani.
Nobody even has their number. I bet. Like they're that close hold. They are micromanagers to an nth degree. Like
here's the thing. I was giving an example of somebody, and just like you said, as you said, in America, a lot of our citizens do not know who the joint chief of staffs are, the generals, because they're replaceable. There's always someone new. They retire. Soleimani was literally the right hand of the head of Iran, which is Khamenei. He was his right hand. He ran things for him everywhere, not just inside Iran. So let's just give you an example. We are in Syria. And Soleimani is on the ground, and all of a sudden he made a deal with a Sunni sheikh to help him out do something, right? Mm-hmm. He's not going to report that back to Tehran. Oh, by the way, today I had a meeting, and I'm going to extort this guy to do this for us. No, he's not going to tell them that. Right. That was close to his heart. It comes from the Middle Eastern pride that he doesn't need to tell anybody what he's doing.
Exactly. This is how they operate. That's why they're also very difficult to work with.
He doesn't trust anybody because if he's going to tell everything to his deputy's just going to shoot him in the head, and that's it. You know what I mean? So I'm Soleimani because I'm Soleimani. No one knows what I'm doing. So, imagine you're a politician in Iraq, and Soleimani has dirt on you, and he wants you to do something for him. Well, guess what? When Soleimani's gone, that dirt is gone as well. So
there's not a record. Like they don't send back cables to headquarters the way we do in the United States. And I don't think people understand this is how it works. I mean, they are true micromanagers. They are on the highest levels are on the ground. And this is, again, it also makes them difficult to partner with because it's just not how we do business in the US. We write everything down, we create a record of it. There's a lot of transparency and that allows us to, again, replace each other rather quickly, but they just don't operate that way. It's totally based on the personality.
Part of the personality, part of how the regime wants them to operate. So he's going to make the shots. He's going to say, blow up an American Humvee or not. He's going to do all that.
Right.
So when he's gone and his experience, don't forget, he fought in the Iranian-Iraq war. He had that charismatic, I'm your savior sort of feel to him, to the Iranians, and also to whoever believed in him outside of Iran. So the new guy they put in his place, it's literally almost like a meme. He can't even fit in his suit. Literally, he can't. And it's not metaphoric. He cannot fit in his suit. It looks so weird on him. So the guy can't. He's not going to be Soleimani, and it's going to take them years because they were not planning for this. So it's going to take them years to.
And the other,
they're still, mourning him. Yeah.
And the other reason you think it wasn't going to happen, I'm assuming, is because you probably didn't think that the United States would have the guts to just do a strike on Soleimani. Because we've had the chance plenty of times before, and we just never did it.
You were there. I'm sure that was frustrating when you guys just watched him roam around the streets and nobody would take him out. He was in the green zone, for God's sake. He was everywhere, and he would fly in and just walk around and be in battlefields, and Bush didn't take him out. Obama didn't take him out. So what made you think Trump was going to do that?
Right. Yeah. And so, there was the next big debate that happened, and this is a super disingenuous debate, and the debate's over at this point, I think. But the critics of that decision would say that we've created this unending escalation after that strike, and as usual, blame America for everything. Do
they know that the Iraqi U.S. bases, and I'm emphasizing on the obviously it's a mutual base. Do they know that they were being bombed and mortar attacked prior to this?
They do. They don't care. They like to wash over that fact, and I remind people of that all the time. Like, listen, there was a lot leading up to this particular decision. The attack on the embassy in Baghdad, the rocketing of U.S. bases, which has been going on forever. Yeah, it killed an American citizen. But just for more context, this kind of rocketing has always been happening. It is a fact of life when you go to the Middle East in the military. We've got these big concrete structures that we run into every time an alarm goes off. This is what happens, and this is coming from Shia militias at the direction of Iran, and which means at the direction of Soleimani. And that debate was highly disingenuous. I don't even know how much we should get into it because it's so silly. And in hindsight, it's even sillier.
No, escalation was happening, and it was always going to happen. And they were literally, Al-Muhandis was on, standing in the gates of the embassy, threatening to enter. So that was 2 days prior to that.
Right.
I mean, and just a fact for you, the militias wrote my name on the U.S. embassy wall that day.
Wow.
They did. They said, "Hey, Stephen,
because you were reporting on them.
We burned your mother's house."
Wow.
Because
did they
metaphorically, America's my mother, and they just burned the U.S. embassy. So this is how much hate they have for me, and it's a source of pride for me as a person because I stood with justice. I stood with Iraqis who were being shot and killed in the streets for demanding their rights. It's a very American thing. It's an Iraqi thing. It's a universal thing to stand with the oppressed against the oppressor when they are obviously being, they're demanding their rights, God-given rights of freedom, prosperity, liberty, and that's all they wanted. So, and made videos, and they were very happy they were there. They felt that they had a victory over America, and I'm sure if they were left unchecked after that moment, next thing would have been like, hey, we could storm a U.S. base. We could do that. We just stormed the embassy. And the day Soleimani was killed, someone that's close to one of the president's offices, hours before that, told me that there are talks of possible sort of a political takeover by militias. They would literally arrest the president and take over the country.
Yeah.
So there was a lot going on in the back that people are trying to write it off right now. Soleimani was not your guardian angel. He had plans for Iraq, and these plans were dark.
Yeah, and plans against U.S. forces as well. There was intelligence that suggested there was another big attack coming. And again, the critics were just losing their minds over this. Oh, fine, let us see the intel. It's like, we're not going to show you the actual raw intel. Just stop it. Stop these disingenuous critiques. And also, the one thing I pointed out at the time was, it doesn't matter whether there's intel or not. This actually doesn't matter because the escalation was happening. We already had evidence. We already had reason to stop the escalation ladder. Like, so the question of intelligence, like secure, set in stone intelligence for a future attack was actually that was almost, there was too much of a big deal made about that. It was true, but in the end, I don't think it was even necessary to justify the killing of Soleimani because he had already done and orchestrated so many attacks against us already. And it was clearly moving in an escalatory fashion.
It was him arriving in Baghdad that night. I don't think his trip was peace talks. I don't know what he was planning,
Really?
but
No,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah, I mean, because Reuters. Here's the thing: Reuters talked about. I think it was Reuters or AP talked about in the earlier days of protest that he came to Baghdad and instructed his militias and all that to quell the protest. So this is a very dangerous man. Iraqis were actually very relieved that he was gone because they blame him for a lot of stuff happening there.
Right.
And they never thought this day would come.
Well, it did. And like you said, I think we can hope in the future for more Iraqis demanding their freedom because, like you said, those are universal demands. And I think people have an intrinsic sense of justice and desire for freedom. And we can only hope that happens for the Iraqi people and the Iranian people and the Syrian people. Hell, everybody.
Of course.
Because
I think there's so much to work between the Iraqis and Americans. Definitely the younger generations. I mean, I see it and I play a video game with these, kids. I like to talk to them, connect to them. And, always I have 3-4 guys that come in I've never talked to before and we chat for an hour or two. They are so, they ask me about the States, where do you live? Oh, we've watched this in the movie. We know this about America. We want to visit America. So they're very friendly to the West. They really want to live. They just want to have a peaceful life and put all this behind them. And I look forward to that day.
Yeah.
There'll be a huge friendship between both people.
Actually, that kind of brings me to one last question before we have to get off the phone here, which is, okay, what's the right American strategy and presence moving forward? Because we have that debate often here.
We cannot disband in Iraq. We cannot just pull out and leave because we're making the same mistake again, and then Iraq is going to redraw us again in a few years. I feel like America should look at Iraq as a stable nation that is a friend, and that's going to definitely keep Iraqis very happy with the American approach because they don't want to be subjects, and I know America doesn't want that. Iran wants that. We should definitely deal harshly with the Iraqi government, not look at them as friends because they're not. And we shouldn't support any of the politicians. We shouldn't support any of the security forces leaders, high-ranked leaders who are sympathetic to the militias and helping them on the side. So definitely targeted sanctions against the politicians. Help Iraqis find the missing money. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that were stolen by Iraqi politicians and God knows who. So a lot of these steps would definitely ensure a long-lasting friendship between Iraqis, and hopefully when they regain their country that they'll definitely have an essence and basis for a long-term friendship.
There you go. And that's what we want. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show, man. Really appreciate it. It was a fascinating conversation. I think people really enjoy that one.
Thank you, Congressman. Thanks for the opportunity, and hopefully we talked about everything and touched up. Thanks for having me on the show.
Hey, thanks for being on it. Really appreciate you taking the time. And everybody, if you like that show, I don't know why you haven't given the show 5